Hello, everybody, and welcome to our fourth lecture here on Period 7. This one's going to cover the Roaring Twenties. So let's go ahead and get right into our lecture today. And always remember, we have our focus question for Period 7. It's going to talk about, as we've been talking about here, progressivism, excuse me, and having both democratic and anti-democratic aspects. Now you might be wondering, where is that going to come involved in here? Because we think of the Roaring Twenties as the era of pop culture. But you're going to see that there's still a lot of progressivism taking place, while there are going to be those who are going to try to put a little bit of the brakes on it. So let's go ahead and move along here. 7.2, Roman numeral 1. So here is the advent of a mass culture begins to happen in America. The rise of pop culture. Because of new technologies that are coming, it helps to bring radios into our homes. Radio will spread ideas and pop culture type of identities that become a national identity for us, not just regional. For instance, baseball will benefit greatly from this. You could be anywhere in America now and you want to hear your favorite team. Many people begin to fall in love with the New York Yankees, and especially the Sultan of SWAT himself, the great Bambino, Babe Ruth. Right? Movies also begin to bring people together. The silent movies first, and then eventually into the 1920s, we'll get our first talkie movies. That's Charlie Chaplin over there on the side. But eventually we're going to get a movie called The Jazz Singer, which becomes our first talking movie ever in our history. And all these things are going to begin to change the way we think about ourselves, the way we think about the United States, and especially bring us a greater awareness of who we are when it comes to our pop culture now. Now moving on, here again is where the key concepts always kind of get a little wanky for me. 7.2, Roman numeral 2, letter C, needs to come first. Then we have to go back to 7.2, Roman numeral 1, letter B, because if I started there chronologically and I just talk about a migration, you'd be wondering, well, what migration? Well, when we were talking about World War I, it was known as the Great Migration. These were African Americans who finally began to leave the South. And again, I gave it to a 1, 2, 3 here for a multiple choice question. Why were they leaving the South? Well, they were trying to escape segregation. There are now jobs to be had in the North because of World War I. Racial violence, lynching is a massive issue. Ida B. Wells was she's not really a muckraker. She kind of comes a little bit before them, but she is somebody who's trying to expose this terrible thing that's happening in the South. There's also a lot of limited economic opportunity, and that's why they begin to go north and west to try to get themselves into better situations. Now, the majority of them are going to wind up in New York, which will triple the population, and they're going to head to a particular place called Harlem. Here's where we pick it up here in 7.2, Roman numeral 1, letter B. You have to kind of go back words in time, and I'll just give you a few moments to flip through your key concepts. Maybe this would be a nice time to take a break. I mean, we're 2 minutes into this. You're probably tired already anyways. All right, so you're back. So we're now at the Harlem Renaissance movement. This massive artistic explosion is going to happen in the 1920s, and it's because of African Americans. They're going to bring a type of African culture that's going to turn out that many white people in the United States are going to absolutely love and try to imitate it. And I think today they call it appropriated in various ways. Langston Hughes was perhaps the most inspirational person at the time. He's a great poet. He wrote a lot of books as well. So a lot of type of poetry is going to come out of here. A various art form is going to come out of the Harlem Renaissance that is going to become very popular at the time. But perhaps the most notable thing is jazz music. African Americans will bring jazz up from the South, and it becomes pretty much the music of the 1920s. Everyone wants to emulate this type of musical form. A decade prior to it, most Americans listened to something called ragtime, which is a little bit more upbeat, but jazz was something very unique and powerful. And to this day, it is one of the greatest art forms, perhaps, ever to come out of the United States. and it's because of the Harlem Renaissance movement that it will take place. There are other various leaders at the time period who aren't necessarily part of the Harlem Renaissance, but they are there at the same time, Marcus Garvey being one of them. He's actually Jamaican born, migrated to America, his family did when he was little. He'll be very famous for his Back to Africa movements. He'll start to preach a lot about ending European colonial rule throughout Africa. He'd like to see Africa become a single state nation, and that became a big goal or dream for him. And I'm going to ask you guys to look up what does UNIA stand for. So you can put that in your notes later on as you guys start to look for it. But again, the Harlem Renaissance is one of these extremely important moments in our history. It really infuses African culture into the mainstream. And it becomes so important to people. To this day, much of our music, much of our entertainment is based a lot out of what happened at the Harlem Renaissance and the African roots that are brought to mainstream and people really embracing it. Oop, I didn't mean to do that. I want to do this. So staying in 7-2 now in C. Remember, we just came out of World War I. So in coming out of World War I, America goes back to that thing of nativism, right? All these Europeans that are coming over, Americans get very, very scared. They think a lot of them are radicals, especially communists, and this led to America's first Red Scare. The 1920s, and we'll talk about this in a few weeks, the 1950s, are very similar to each other. They're the decades that come out of a war. They're the decades where we start to fear a lot about the communists, and they both gave us a Red Scare. This is the first one. You see a lot of these labor unions again becoming very activist and embracing what seems to be socialistic and communistic attitudes. And they began to blame it on immigrant culture. A. Mitchell Palmer was the Attorney General under Woodrow Wilson. And he began what is the famous Palmer raids, where he began to break up various communist meetings. He began to arrest men, many of which were actually Americans. And in this cartoon, what is happening here? Uncle Sam is putting a bunch of people in a box, and he's saying Merry Christmas to Lenin, and he's shipping this box off to Russia. Well, that kind of actually happened. They round up several hundred individuals that they believe are actively involved in the Communist Party. Some of them are actually American citizens, and they put them on a ship, and they sent them off to Russia, telling them they can never come back to the United States. So imagine just throwing a bunch of people out of the country that we think are anarchists, socialists, and communists. 2 Italians during this time period, Sacco and Vanzetti. There's this trial that's going to happen because up in Massachusetts, there's going to be a robbery that's going to take place, a payroll robbery of a certain business. You can look up the details if you like. And then someone's going to be killed because of this. Someone's going to be shot during the robbery. And Sacco and Vanzetti are 2 Italian immigrants who are also known anarchists. And so the authorities basically arrest them and say they're the ones that did it. They're put on trial. The evidence against them is flimsy at best. There is a gun that's discovered, but they can never prove exactly whose gun it is. And they're both going to be sentenced to death in the electric chair. They're going to exhaust their appeals after several years, but eventually both of them will go to the electric chair. This became very controversial. The nation of Italy especially was very upset since these were Italian nationalists. They were Italian citizens. But it just shows how far our fear of the other was starting to come back. This idea of nativism was coming back. The fear of the things that we don't understand. It wound up putting these 2 men to death in a trial that for a crime they may or probably did not commit. We're shipping people off to Russia because we don't want them here anymore. In 722, so again, we're going to look over there, letter A. Here it specifically tells you a couple things. You see nativist campaigns come back, right? The rise of the KKK, for instance, in the 1920s is so important at this time because what the what the Klan winds up doing is they switch their ideology. They're not just about a white-black situation, but they are now anti-immigrant. They're also going to be anti-women voting, and they're going to be pro-prohibition. They're going to be for prohibition. And they're going to become a very popular type of entity during the 1920s. Thousands upon thousands of Americans will join the ranks of the KKK, basically because they are afraid of immigrants. The United States will pass emergency quota acts trying to restrict immigration coming from America. First, you get the Emergency Quota Act of 1921 and the Immigration Act of 1924. What do we mean by quotas? Well, they're going to go back to U.S. Census. They're going to look at the census first from the year 1910, and they're going to come up with this percentage. Only a certain percentage from your country of origin can continue to migrate to America. But that wasn't good enough, so they'll eventually get the Immigration Act of 1924. They'll go all the way back to 1890 census, right? The 1890 census, and start talking about only 3% of whoever came in 1890 can now come from this point on. So if 100,000 Italians migrated to America in 1890, only 3% of that number can continue to migrate. If you only had 50,000, well, only 3% of that number, that quota, can now continue to migrate to the United States. One of the sad things about the Immigration Act is it really shut the door on the Japanese because they didn't really have a presence in 1890. In fact, at the time, President Calvin Coolidge, who winds up signing the act, one of the things he regretted was how it really did hurt the Japanese. He will actually go on record saying he didn't approve of that particular part of the act, but he does wind up signing it because, again, Americans are very afraid of this Red Scare that they believe is going to ruin the country. 721D now, we get to talk about these political controversies. So here we go. Progressivism. Americans had it a lot. They had about 20 years of progressivism. Theodore Roosevelt, William Howard Taft, and Woodrow Wilson. So the Republicans in 1920 run an election where they call it a return to normalcy. So you know that word never really existed until this moment. They kind of made up this word normalcy. And they nominate Warren G. Harding, the last of the Ohio presidents. Warren G. Harding, a nice enough guy, but not the brightest bulb in the package. Basically, what the Republicans want to do when they say a return to normalcy, they want to go back to the Gilded Age politics. They want to go back to the times of Benjamin Harrison was the president, right? James Garfield and Chester Arthur, that time period where basically Congress ruled everything. The president was just kind of there, and they practiced laissez-faire economics and allowed big business to be big business. And then a massive political scandal is going to happen. The Teapot Dome scandal. This is truly, as I told you earlier when we got to Ulysses S. Grant, there are really three massive political presidential scandals at the time. Ulysses S. Grant had the first one with Credit Mobilier. This is the second one, and of course Watergate is the third. But you're probably wondering, well, what is Teapot Dome? Well, I'm just going to give you a preview because I'm going to give you a little something to read and take notes on later on in class. But Teapot Dome is an area out in Wyoming. It's where oil is, and the various rock formations out there, out in Wyoming, they look like teapots. So that's why the area is called Teapot Dome. But there's oil there. But this oil is reserved for the U.S. Navy. So only the U.S. Navy is supposed to be able to use it. But while Warren G. Harding is president, they're going to secretively sell that area without congressional approval, which is against the law, to private industries. Now, we might think again, well, I don't know, is that such a big deal? Yeah, it's a massive deal. It is definitely scamming the government, cheating people in all kinds of ways. And Warren G. Harding did sign the executive order to do this. We don't know if he was under duress or not because he's going to wind up having a heart attack and dying before we can find out what his actual involvement was. I'm going to talk a little bit more about Warren Harding in class. There's a lot to talk about with him, actually. But we'll talk a little bit more about this. And maybe in your notes, too, you can maybe show me that you have found a few things yourself you'd like to talk about when it comes to this particular scandal, the Teapot Dome scandal. So Calvin Coolidge becomes president. He was the vice president. Silent Cal. Very interesting individual. I'll tell you personally, as I've grown over the years in teaching history, I used to think very little of Calvin Coolidge, but I've kind of come around on him a little bit. He's not nowhere near my favorite president or in a top 5 or anything like that, but there are actually some interesting things about this individual. Yeah, he's a small government conservative, right? He believes very much in business. 2 famous quotes: "The man who builds a factory builds a temple. The man who works there worships there." I would like you guys in your notes to tell me what you think that means. I want to see that in your notes. I'm not going to tell you what it means. I'm going to have you write that in your notes. The man who builds a factory builds a temple. The man who works there worships there. What do you think that means? And then, of course, probably his most famous quote is, "The chief business of American people is business." So our number one business of America is business. He's a very big business guy. And a very dry sense of humor as well. He's called Silent Cal because he rarely spoke. There's an anecdote. It's more than likely not a true story, but it was told all the time, even while he was alive, that supposedly there was a state dinner. He was sitting at a table, and a wife of one of the senators looked over at him and said, "Mr. President, I bet I can get you to say more than 2 words tonight." He looked over at her and said, "You lose." And then he never spoke again. And that became a massive running joke throughout Washington. But he would give a speech at some function. He was invited somewhere, and there were newspapermen there. And he actually said that this shows you how sometimes the news creates rumors that aren't true. And he claimed that never happened. So I'm tending to believe that that's just one of those funny stories I like to tell about Silent Cal, because he generally didn't speak, but he did have a very bizarre sense of humor, and he was known for that as well. Couple contradictory things here. You think about it. In 1924, Coolidge voted. I shouldn't say voted. I should say vetoed. See that? See where I made a mistake right there? And I'm not changing it, as I'm so far into this now. But that should say vetoed the World War I Veterans World War Adjustment Compensation Act, or a bonus bill. They were supposed to give a bonus to veterans of World War I, and he vetoed it. He didn't vote it. That's wrong. I don't know what I was thinking. It's vetoed. Congress will override him. He said something to the effect that paid patriotism is no longer patriotism. So he didn't think that that's something you should be doing for people who volunteer to fight. This is going to get something that's going to create something very tense in America when the Great Depression happens. So pay attention to this Compensation Act or bonus bill, because it's going to lead to a very tense moment in America when the Great Depression hits. In 1924, he did sign the Indian Citizenship Act that officially made Native Americans U.S. citizens. Although many Native Americans were already becoming citizens, but this made this official. He was also extremely pro-civil rights for African Americans. In one of his State of the Union addresses, he even talked about that the rights of all Americans belong to white and black. He was very pro African Americans getting their civil rights. So I think that's kind of cool about him. But again, he is this very ultra-conservative, anti-progressive kind of a guy. He will win his own election in 1924. They have a campaign, Keep Cool with Coolidge. And Americans really do like this guy. They find him funny and odd. The middle class especially liked them. The 1920s is a very prosperous time period, as we'll talk about later on in another video. A lot of Americans are playing the stock market. A lot of Americans are starting to feel a sense of, hey, we're getting a little bit wealthy here after the World War I. And then the bottom, of course, is going to fall out. All right, so 721D. So continuing in that same thought there of political scandals, it also talks about the other debates that are going on. Gender roles. Women, for instance, in the 1920s are starting to kind of express themselves. Young emancipated women known as flappers. All right, so that's something I'd like, again, you guys to look up and tell me exactly what flappers were and what did they do and why did they dress this way. Margaret Sanger, the mother of the birth control movement, very popular, basically she was a doctor at the time. She has to flee the country. She writes a book called What Every Little Girl Should Know, which was trying to express to young girls what happens to their body as they go through puberty. You may have remembered this thing called the Comstock Law, who gets to decide what is obscene. And so that law went after her, and she almost went to jail. She has to flee to England for a couple of years, just because she wants young girls to understand what puberty is, right? Modernism is coming to America. It's clashing with science and religion. Right, this is the Scope monkey trials. All right, now I don't have that written down there. So again, Scope monkey trials. Why don't you look that up again and briefly try to tell me what the Scope monkey trials were? This is when science and religion go to court in the great state of Tennessee. Yep, Tennessee. Issues related to race and immigration obviously is an issue. We've already talked about that with nativism on the rise. This is prohibition as well, right? We're not supposed to be drinking alcohol during prohibition, and these were known as speakeasies. So we'll get into some of that as well, talking about the speakeasies. We get the rise of gangsters. Your Al Capone is at this time period, the mob boss of Chicago. So a lot of various things are taking place in the 1920s. And let's see when you guys do your poster project if any of this you can relate to and perhaps use in your posters. So with that, I believe this is it, and we'll say goodnight.